Shabbat Shalom, everyone. This week is Parashah number 30, Kedoshim, meaning holy people. And we're going to be starting in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 1. That is Leviticus chapter 19, verse 1. Adonai said to Moshe, "Speak to the entire community of Israel. Tell them, you are to be holy, because I, Adonai your God, am holy. Every one of you is to revere his father and mother, and you are to keep my Shabbats. I am Adonai your God. Do not turn to idols, and do not cast metal gods for yourselves. I am Adonai your God. When you offer a sacrifice of peace offerings to Adonai, offer it in a way that will make you accepted. It is to be eaten the same day you offer it, and the following day. But if any of it remains until the third day, it is to be burned up completely. If any of it is eaten on the third day, it will have become a disgusting thing and will not be accepted. Moreover, everyone who eats it will bear the consequences of profaning something holy meant for Adonai. That person will be cut off from his people. When you harvest the ripe crops produced in your land, don't harvest all the way to the corners of your field, and don't gather the ears of grain left by the harvesters. Likewise, don't gather the grapes left on the vine or fallen on the ground after harvest. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. I am Adonai your God. Do not steal from, defraud, or lie to each other. Do not swear by my name falsely, which would be profaning the name of your God. I am Adonai. Do not oppress or rob your neighbor. Specifically, you are not to keep back the wages of a hired worker all night until morning. Do not speak a curse against a deaf person or place an obstacle in the way of a blind person. Rather, fear your God. I am Adonai. Do not be unjust in judging. Show neither partiality to the poor nor deference to the mighty, but with justice judge your neighbor. Do not go around spreading slander among your people, but also don't stand idly by when your neighbor's life is at stake. I am Adonai. Do not hate your brother in your heart, but rebuke your neighbor frankly, so that you won't carry sin because of him. Don't take vengeance on or bear a grudge against any of your people. Rather, love your neighbor as yourself. I am Adonai. Observe my regulations. Don't let your livestock mate with those of another kind. Don't sow your field with two different kinds of grain, and don't wear a garment of cloth made with two different kinds of thread. If a man has sexual relations with a woman who was a slave intended for another man, and she has neither been redeemed nor given her freedom, there is to be an investigation. They are not to be put to death because she was not free. In reparation, he is to bring a ram as a guilt offering for himself to the entrance of the tent of meeting. The Kohen will make atonement for him with the ram of the guilt offering before Adonai for the sin he committed, and he will be forgiven for the sin he committed. When you enter the land and plant various kinds of fruit trees, you are to regard its fruit as forbidden. For 3 years it will be forbidden to you and not eaten. In the 4th year, all its fruit will be holy for praising Adonai. But in the 5th year, you may eat its fruit, so that it will produce even more for you. I am Adonai your God. Don't eat anything with blood. Do not practice divination or fortune-telling. Don't round your hair at the temples or mar the edges of your beard. Don't cut gashes in your flesh when someone dies or tattoo yourselves. I am Adonai. Do not debase your daughter by making her a prostitute, so that the land will not fall into prostitution and become full of shame. Keep my Shabbats and revere my sanctuary. I am Adonai. Do not turn to spirit mediums or sorcerers. Don't seek them out to be defiled by them. I am Adonai your God. Stand up in the presence of a person with gray hair. Show respect for the old. You are to fear your God. I am Adonai. If a foreigner stays with you in your land, do not do him wrong. Rather, treat the foreigner staying with you like the native born among you. You are to love him as yourself, for you were foreigners in the land of Egypt. I am Adonai your God. Don't be dishonest when measuring length, weight, or capacity. Rather, use an honest balance scale, honest weights, an honest bushel dry measure, and an honest gallon liquid measure. I am Adonai your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Observe all my regulations and rulings, and do them. I am Adonai. Adonai said to Moshe, say to the people of Israel, if someone from the people of Israel or one of the foreigners living in Israel sacrifices one of his children to Molech, he must be put to death. The people of the land are to stone him to death. I too will set myself against him and cut him off from his people, because he has sacrificed his child to Molech, defiling my sanctuary and profaning my holy name. If the people of the land look the other way when that man sacrifices his child to Molech and fail to put him to death, then I will set myself against him, his family, and everyone who follows him to go fornicating after Molech and cut them off from their people. The person who turns to spirit mediums and sorcerers to go fornicating after them, I will set myself against him and cut him off from his people. Therefore, consecrate yourselves. You people must be holy, because I am Adonai your God. Observe my regulations and obey them. I am Adonai, who sets you apart to be holy. A person who curses his father or mother must be put to death. Having cursed his father or mother, his blood is on him. If a man commits adultery with another man's wife, that is, with the wife of a fellow countryman, both the adulterer and the adulteress must be put to death. The man who goes to bed with his father's wife has disgraced his father sexually, and both of them must be put to death. Their blood is on them. If a man goes to bed with his daughter-in-law, both of them must be put to death. They have committed a perversion, and their blood is on them. If a man goes to bed with a man as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They must be put to death. Their blood is on them. If a man marries a woman and her mother, it is a depravity. They are to be put to death by fire, both he and they, so that there will not be depravity among you. If a man has sexual relations with an animal, he must be put to death, and you are to kill the animal. If a woman approaches an animal and has sexual relations with it, you are to kill the woman and the animal. Their blood will be on them. If a man takes his sister, his father's daughter, or his mother's daughter and has sexual relations with her, and she consents, it is a shameful thing. They are to be cut off publicly. He has had sexual relations with his sister, and he will bear the consequences of their wrongdoing. If a man goes to bed with a woman in her menstrual period and has sexual relations with her, he has exposed the source of her blood, and she has exposed the source of her blood. Both of them are to be cut off from their people. You are not to have sexual relations with your mother's sister or your father's sister. A person who does this has had sexual relations with his close relative. They will bear the consequences of their wrongdoing. If a man goes to bed with his uncle's wife, he has disgraced his uncle sexually. They will bear the consequences of their sin and die childless. If a man takes his brother's wife, it is uncleanness. He has disgraced his brother sexually. They will be childless. You are to observe all my regulations and rulings and act on them, so that the land which I am bringing you will not vomit you out. Do not live by the regulations of the nation which I am expelling ahead of you, because they did all these things, which is why I detested them. But to you I have said, you will inherit their land. I will give it to you as a possession, a land flowing with milk and honey. I am Adonai your God, who has set you apart from other peoples. Therefore, you are to distinguish between clean and unclean animals and between clean and unclean birds. Do not make yourself detestable with an animal, bird, or reptile that I have set apart for you to regard as unclean. Rather, you people are to be holy for me, because I, Adonai, am holy, and I have set you apart from other peoples, so that you can belong to me. A man or woman who is a spirit medium or sorcerer must be put to death. They are to stone them to death. Their blood will be on them. Amen.
I want to open today's Torah portion in an unusual way. I want to read from the New Testament, book of Romans. This is from Romans 13, verses 8 through 14. Don't owe anyone anything except to love one another. For whoever loves his fellow human being has fulfilled Torah. For the commandments, don't commit adultery, don't murder, don't steal, don't covet, and any others are summed up in this one rule: love your neighbor as yourself. Love does not do harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fullness of Torah. Now, besides all this, you know at what point of history we stand. So it's high time for you to rouse yourselves from sleep. For the final deliverance is nearer than when we first came to trust. The night's almost over. The day's almost here, so let us put aside the deeds of darkness and arm ourselves with the weapons of light. Let us live properly, as people do in the daytime, not partying and getting drunk, not engaging in sexual immorality and other excesses, not quarreling and being jealous. Instead, clothe yourselves with the Lord Yeshua the Messiah. Don't waste your time thinking about how to provide for the sinful desires of your old nature. The Apostle Paul believed that Yeshua was going to return any day. So time was very short. And he thought that the end times had been entered, and the world as he knew it was about to be subjected to the worst evil and violence that had ever been known, to then be followed by the establishment of the kingdom of God on earth. Therefore, he spoke with great urgency in his voice. You know the point of history we stand, he says. Well, I say the same thing to you. Only, guess what? I have a lot more evidence than Paul for saying we are either standing upon or we've stepped over that threshold into the end times, and time is far shorter than most people can imagine. Arouse from your sleep, Paul urges. Let us live properly, he admonishes. And then he gives a list of things that God finds offensive and sinful and wicked. This is what makes knowing God's 33-year-old Torah so vitally important and relevant to this 21st century. And as believers, we must arouse from our slumber. We must shuck off those things that hinder our relationship with God and live lives of holiness. This particular section of Leviticus is often set apart as something rather special by the Hebrews. It's a long chapter. It's often referred to as a Torah within the Torah. Chapter 19, sort of a Mini-Torah, a Reader's Digest version, if you would, of the commandments that form the foundation for all the other rules and regulations of the law of Moses. And just as we're told that the command to love Jehovah with all of our heart, soul, and might, and to love our neighbor ourselves is the basis upon which all the Torah commands stand, chapter 19 lays out what amounts to the underlying and overriding goal of God's word and his intentions for us: to be holy. So, here we find the definition of what it means to be holy, what a holy life looks like for God's people. Now, the ancient rabbis taught that this chapter is to be read before the whole assembly because the 10 Commandments are embodied in it. Therefore, in the same way that Moses read the 10 Commandments before the whole nation of Israel at God's instruction, so chapter 19 is to be read before the whole congregation. Now, I'd like to quote to you a brief passage of an essay written by Joseph Hertz, who was the chief rabbi of the United Hebrew Congregations during the time leading up to and during World War II. And he says this about Leviticus 19 in general, about holiness specifically. He says, developing the idea of holiness as order and not confusion. This list, the verses of Leviticus 19, upholds rectitude and straight dealing as holy, and contradiction and double dealing as against holiness. Theft, lying, false witness, cheating in weights and measures, all kinds of dissembling, such as speaking ill of the deaf and presumably smiling to their faces, hating your brother in your heart while speaking kindly to him. These are clearly contradictions between what seems and what is. Or as Professor G.J. Wenham put it, holiness is expressed in moral integrity, which in turn is expressed by physical wholeness. Bluntly, do not talk to me about the Holy One, Yeshua, living in your heart at the same moment you're denying the need to live a holy life. Don't tell me that you have the Spirit of God dwelling in you, but you see no need for obedience to God's only given moral code in the Torah. Don't tell me that. And what is God's Torah but the spelling out of what we call morality? Morality is what is good as separated from what is evil. I'm not saying that we're necessarily to act out these laws established in an ancient Middle Eastern cultural context in exactly the same way they were acted out over 3,000 years ago. However, some things they should be brought forward as intact as possible. Biblical feasts, for example. The definition of what is moral and what is not was set down by God. It doesn't really have inherent cultural or time barriers, and thus these principles should not be altered by man, as the church has attempted to do since the creation of the Constantinian church in the 4th century. See, it's interesting that Rabbi Hertz sees one of the primary defining attributes of holiness as order. Order, as defined by God, not by man, as opposed to chaos and confusion. So, holiness is an inner condition that must be expressed outwardly to have any practical value. Our God is not an inwardly holy God who behaves in an outwardly unholy way. So for us to claim personal holiness because of our relationship with Yeshua, but to behave as though our decisions and actions are separate from that inner holiness makes us hypocrites. Hypocrites in the worst possible way, and it's most doubtful that God sees us as truly saved and set apart. Therefore, we are to accept as a gift from God by means of Messiah a new essential nature that produces a kind of holiness that transforms our moral decisions, our behavior into a kind that mimics and is in harmony with that of the Creator. If there is one single principle of God that the entire world is violated, and that is the greatest single cause outside of sin itself for the global chaos that we watch on our evening news or read about in the media or experience it in our own lives, it is the one that is at the heart of all that God reflects in his nature, and therefore to violate it is to reject harmony with him. And that spiritual law that I speak of is that of dividing, electing, and separating. Expressed in the negative, the principle is that those who love the Lord are not to improperly mix things that are set aside for life with things that are destined for destruction. To be and remain holy means we're not to mix the holy with the unholy. We are not to even cross God-erected boundaries and mix two things that, while each may well be good and acceptable of themselves, they're to be kept separated and they're not to be combined. We're not to mix the holy with the unholy, or even the holy with the common, nor the clean with the unclean. Further, we are not to redesignate things that God calls evil as good, or vice versa. We are not to replace God's laws with new and evolving theological philosophies and popular ideas that are called doctrines. To do any of these things is to create tevel, confusion. And confusion is completely at odds with the Lord's attributes of wholeness and order. And confusion is the state of the whole world today, isn't it? Absolute confusion. The cause of it all is improper mixing of things at many different levels. See, the Hebrew word for this improper mixing of things, the crossing of God's boundaries, is kelayim. And there have been profound writings by the ancient Hebrew sages on the subject, as well as much fanciful allegory put forth especially by Christian institutions. Kelayim, improper mixing, results in tevel, confusion. Leviticus 19:19 is, of course, not the only place in the Torah where a specific edict against kelayim is mandated. Deuteronomy 22 also adds, and in some cases merely repeats, more examples of improper mixing, which results in tevel. Put another way, improper mixing or improper substitution of God's laws with religious doctrines always results in confusion. Here are a couple of examples. Deuteronomy 22:5. A woman shall not wear man's clothing, nor shall a man put on a woman's clothing, for whoever does these things is an abomination to the Lord your God. Deuteronomy 22:9. You shall not sow your vineyard with two kinds of seed, lest all the produce of the seed which you have sown and the increase of the vineyard becomes defiled. You shall not plow with an ox and a donkey together. You shall not wear a material mixed of wool and linen together. Now, I'd like to share with you the general understanding among the Hebrew sages of the underlying principles and problems with improper mixing, kilayim. To begin with, there are three types of mixing, or hybridization, spoken of between Leviticus 19 and Deuteronomy 22. First is the kind represented by sowing grain in a vineyard. This is generally what is meant by not sowing two types of seed together. This is considered the most extreme example, and it produces the most serious result. When two species of plants are planted in super close proximity to one another, the result is that the roots become enmeshed. Each derives some part of its source of nourishment from the other. And it's not that the grape will start to look like barley, nor that barley will turn the color of ripening grapes. The outward physical characteristics don't necessarily change. However, several of the internal attributes can change. Taste, texture, aroma. A host of other changes can occur as a result of this crossing over of boundaries. As far as a category or a class of kilayim, to too closely plant two kinds of seeds together is considered to be the same as interbreeding two different species of behama, domesticated animals. The second category the ancient sages delineated is represented by the prohibition against harnessing an ox and a donkey together, ostensibly to pull a cart or plow a field. That is the yoking together of two inherently different creatures for the purpose of using them to perform similar work. Here, the hybridization is not in any kind of a biological mixing, but in their action and in their function. The problem is in using two different species, each designed for different purposes, for the same type of common work, presumably with that work suitable for the one, but not so much for the other. So it's not that the attributes of either species is somehow altered. Rather, it is that the function each was created to perform was altered due to improper mixing of functions by humans. Third category, illustrated by the wearing of clothing made of a mixture of wool and linen, is kind of a middle ground between those first two categories. Now, even though on the one hand, the two fibers, wool and linen, come from entirely different sources, they should not be woven together to produce something of a singular purpose. Now, an important feature to note of each of these cases is that there is nothing inherently wrong, evil, unclean, or abnormal about any of these species of plants or animals individually that would make them taboo. It's when God-ordained boundaries are crossed and the two separate species are combined that the problem arises. And as when we discussed clean and unclean and found that clean animals were not inherently better or more godly or more normal as compared to unclean animals, so it is with these forbidden mixtures. Linen and wool woven together don't necessarily produce a physically inferior cloth as compared to pure linen or pure wool to make a pure cloth. And in fact, depending on one's taste, a wine made of certain grapes produced by having a certain variety of wheat or barley grown underneath and alongside the grapevine might actually be desirable. Rather, it is simply God's sovereign decision as to what improper mixing is. You know, we can search for the why of these choices all day long. And I promise you, the most answers will be allegorical in nature, generally pure guesses, because in most instances, Jehovah has not chosen to tell us the why behind his decisions. Not knowing just bugs the living daylights out of humans. So we continue our determined search for the why. And that leads us to then deciding if we can find no rational, logical why, then there's no good reason to obey the commandment. See, we see that line of thinking in our era, particularly as concerns all the matters that surround the LGBTQ movement. And the question that's usually posed is, well, what harm does it cause? I mean, if it's not personally harming you, then why is it any of your business what other people do? So the general position taken is, well, what two people do in private, that's their business. Besides, that was just an ancient taboo. It was obeyed by ignorant, primitive people, which no longer has a place in the modern and enlightened world of the 21st century. If it were only the secular world arguing for that point of view, I wouldn't be terribly concerned. But sadly, more and more denominations within the modern church have adopted that same stance, some within Judaism. In some cases, it has become a new core belief and doctrine. Not that long ago, kind of ironic, there was a great hand-wringing within the church over the selection of a Catholic pope because he was staunchly anti-gay marriage and anti-abortion. The church is in a complete quandary on how to react because it has abandoned God's biblical moral code and thus has so mixed itself with the ways of the world thinking it is the loving and peaceful thing to do. Well, my advice is abandon your search for why. Instead, focus on discovering the patterns, how one pattern intertwines with the next. Then your understanding of who God is, how he operates, what he expects from us will be increased, and your frustration and your doubts will decrease. In the end, it's about obedience. It's not about our agreement or disagreement with God's choices. And rather than deal with more commandments in Leviticus 19, I want to end our discussion on improper mixing that results in confusion, again in Hebrew, kilayim, that results in tevel, by showing you something in the New Testament that is a prime example of kilayim in action. And it is a statement of the Apostle Paul that is one of the most quoted, yet most misunderstood. Now, I'm going to use the King James Version because the ways it's worded is that it's just the most familiar to our ears. 2 Corinthians 6:14, be ye not unequally yoked together with unbelievers, for what fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness? What communion hath light with darkness? See, we see from the Torah that Paul was not making up some new theology. He was simply stating the Torah principle of kilayim, no improper mixing. Actually, he was referring directly to Deuteronomy 22:10, where it says that an ox and a donkey are not to be brought into union to pull a plow. And here in 2 Corinthians, righteousness should never be mixed with unrighteousness, or should light be mixed with darkness. See, here's the thing. Paul was doing what Yeshua did, and what we should do as we seek to reapply, not to reinterpret, and especially not to remake the Torah for our time. Paul takes a command, do not unequally yoke an ox and a donkey, and takes it from the purely physical, earthbound realm into the spiritual, heavenly realm it was always intended to proclaim. Just how is that so? Because Paul equates the principle of unequal yoking of physical things, like donkeys and oxen, to the unequal yoking of spiritual things, like righteousness and unrighteousness, holiness and unholiness. For the believer, there is a strictly defined boundary established by God between righteousness and unrighteousness, between light and darkness. And remember, light and darkness, as we saw in Genesis, or in choshech, are spiritual opposites in their essences. Or means light, but it means it in the sense of enlightenment from God. Choshech means darkness, but in the sense of wickedness and deception. For humanity in general, and God worshipers specifically, neither the physical nor the spiritual boundaries are to be blurred or crossed. No kilayim, no improper mixing. That is the meaning of be ye not unequally yoked, whether it's the Old Testament or the New Testament. Chapter 19 ends with God's reminder to follow all of his laws and commands, not just the convenient ones. Chapter 20 continues God's lesson in holiness to the general population of Israel. And the thing for us to notice is that in the previous chapter, God laid down a series of rules and ordinances that basically said, don't do this as the pagans do. Instead, do something else. Now in chapter 20, Yehovah brings this back up, and he says, if you do any of these forbidden things I've already told you not to do, then this is what's going to happen. In other words, there is a penalty for a violation of God's commands. And this chapter ends with the same idea that chapter 19 begins. Chapter 20, verse 26 says, "Rather you people are to be holy for me, because I, Adonai, am holy. And I have set you apart from the other peoples so that you can belong to me."
For more teaching and information, visit us online today. Come and be a part of our fellowship. Here at The Seed, enjoy worshiping and learning God's Word with us.